In today's episode of Tristan Take Video, I'm teaching 8 ways to take better cycling photos with your phone. This is part 2 of a 3-part video series that I'm making on how to use your phone to take better cycling photography, with part 1 that can be seen up here. In part 1, I discuss the basics of using your phone and how to take simple photos with it using things like exposure control, lens choice, and lighting optimization. If you haven't seen that episode, I do recommend you go and watch it because it's going to give a lot more context to this entire video. In this video, I'm discussing more of the creative concepts of photography that I've learned over the past 15 years as a commercial cycling photographer, teaching things like how to minimize the elements out of your photos to make them more interesting, how to separate your subject from the background using lens choice and exposure control, what I look for in photos to make them more visually appealing, and also how I edit my photos in my phone using nothing more than the Photos app to give them that special something before I post them on Instagram or on my website. So before I go too far, let's roll a little intro and then we'll get into it. This is 8 ways to take better cycling photos with your phone. Let's do it. Alrighty, let's jump into part 2 of this video series. Now, as I said, this is part 2 of a 3-part video series. It's taken me a number of months to record and release this video, and I want to say a massive thank you to you guys before I go any further for your patience in me releasing this part 2. I promise part 3 will not be released as far into the future as this one was from part 1. Okay, so you've watched part 1, you understand how to use your phone. You want to go out and take some better cycling photos. Where do you start? This is one of the key messages that I get the most while I'm on Instagram. How do I take better cycling photos using my phone? My number 1 response for everyone who ever messages me about how to take better cycling photos is this: shoot in better light. When I refer to the concept of better light, what I'm talking about is nicer light that accentuates your subject's features, makes a photo visually interesting, and creates mood and feeling within a photo. For me personally, I'm always looking for more golden light that creates more mood and atmosphere in my photos, or I'm looking for more dark and moody and dramatic light to create more drama in my photos. Usually the best light occurs within the first hour of the day and the last hour of the day, and if you have seen any of my iPhone photography either on my Tristan Take photo or my Tristan Take 365 Instagram account, you'll know that my favorite photos are the ones taken towards the end of the day, and that's often why I write at those times. I also think those are the better looking photos, and this is why. When you're shooting at the start of the day or at the end of the day, the direction, the height, and the color of the light is what creates depth, mood, and feeling. At the start of the day or at the end of the day, the light is more golden, it's warm, it's got a vibe to it. I generally just find it's nicer to look at. In the middle of the day, especially in harsh midday light, I often find that the colors are blown out and the shadows are often very dark and harsh. As you can see from these photos here, this is midday in the harsh Spanish summer sun, and the light and the shadows are very bright and very contrasty. Whereas if you look at these images shot in the mid-afternoon in winter, you can see that the light is much more golden and much more enjoyable to look at. If you can't get good light though, let's jump into point number 2. So my point number 2 is to minimize your colors and composition in your photos to get a visually simple image. For me personally, I often find a visually simple image is always more attractive. The reason for that is because my eye doesn't need to search around the frame looking for what to focus on, and on a deeper psychological level, it's generally more calming for people to look at a simple image rather than a busy one. Now this goes a little further than simple cycling photography with your phone, but the world is not a visually simple place. When you step out your door, you're bombarded with things like advertising billboards and natural visual clutter. Our eyes are absorbing so much information every single moment of every single day that if you can take a photo that removes all of those elements and break your photo down to its simplest compositional and color form, that you'll end up with a more visually appealing photo. If you take this scene that I'm sitting in right now, for example, you can see that there's very few visual elements going on, and in my opinion, I think this makes for a simple scene for your eye to look at. The color of my shirt is very similar to what's going on in the background. There's only a couple of key visual elements in the frame, being me and my bike behind me. You've got a tiny bit of color with this small plant down here, and overall the scene looks quite minimal. If you look at some of the other videos I've made, including part 1 here, you can see that there's more going on in that frame, and if you look at this scene here with a very messy and a very cluttered desk, you'll find that there's so much going on that your eye is drawn everywhere rather than to the subject, which is me presenting this to you. I use this example as a very immediate example as how reducing the elements out of the frame can make for a more aesthetically pleasing image for your eye to look at because you're not searching around for your subject to focus on. These days, with the majority of the world viewing your photography on a tiny little screen, which is their phone, there's not enough space in order to fit multiple complex subjects going on in the one photo. So if you can reduce the number of elements within your photo, both compositionally and in terms of colors, you'll find that your photos are easier to look at, they're nicer to look at, and you're gonna end up with a more aesthetically pleasing photo. One of the great things about cycling and cycling photography is that it's very easy to use visual leading lines in order to draw your viewer's eye to the subject. You can use the horizon line, you can use trees, you can use the road itself. Any visual elements that draw your eye to the subject are going to mean that the viewer has a point of focus within the frame, and so instead of their eye needing to search around for what to look at, their eye is naturally drawn to that subject. Okay, so along with point number 2, where reducing visual elements out of your frame through composition and colors is one way of creating a visually minimal and aesthetically pleasing image, point number 3 is how to remove clutter from the background and pay attention to what's going on around your subject in order to get a better looking photo. I usually refer to this as framing out the mess. So if you take this photo here, for example, you can see that it's quite a cluttered image. There's a lot going on around the subject that draws your eye away from the subject. When you compare that image to this image here, you can see that there's less clutter and it's easier to understand what's going on in the photo and also what to focus on. Things that will often pop up in your photo are things like bins, power lines, street signs, the most common of which is actually Armco, the metal railings that run along the sides of roads. These are the small details within the background of an image that if you can get rid of, you'll find your photo becomes more simple and more enjoyable to look at. If you're riding along and you're finding that your photos are a bit busy and a bit messy and there's too many things within the frame to distract your eye, wait until you're at a more simple area of your ride, maybe a spot where there's more nature behind, there's more trees, or there's a more simple color scheme going on, and take the photos at that point instead. One of the number one ways that I combat this visual complexity going on in photos is to look for ways that you can take silhouettes. Silhouettes are actually a great way of taking nice, visually appealing photos where there's not much going on, because if you place your subject against the sky or a bright background, they become very apparent in the frame, and the simplicity of the sky or the wall or the light going on behind means that the subject stands out. Cycling is such a great sport to use silhouettes for because a bike is so easily recognizable. The reason that I also like taking silhouettes is the fact that the sky is often much more visually simple than what's on the ground, so by getting down low, by placing your subject against the sky, and by reducing the visual elements out of your frame by dragging the exposure down, you'll often find that you get a visually simple photo without too much more effort. Now, point number 4, I did actually discuss in reasonable length in part 1 of this video series, and that is using the right lens for the right scenario. As this video series is to do with using your phone, I'm going to talk about the Apple iPhone and the different lens choices available within that, but most phones offer a similar range of lens choices no matter what brand you go for. The 3 lenses I'm going to talk about are the wide-angle lens, the standard lens, and the telephoto lens. The wide-angle lens is a 0.5 lens. This is used for action. You can get really close to your subject. It looks great for fast-moving subjects. You'll find with the wide-angle lens that if you're close to your subject and you track them with the camera, the subject will remain smooth and the background will blur. When I'm riding along and I hold my phone near my handlebars, you can see that the handlebars are being tracked by the phone, they're moving at the same speed, and the background behind starts to blur. This is just one example as to how to use the wide-angle lens, but I find by using that wide-angle lens, the image feels very, very first person, and it gives quite a cool look to the photo as well. You can use the wide-angle lens in all kinds of creative ways because it does stretch out the edges of the frame and give you a more distorted look, but you do need to be careful because by using the wide-angle lens, you can draw in distracting elements into your frame, so be conscious of that in order to avoid that visual clutter that I was talking about in points 2 and point 3. The standard lens is the 1x lens. Now this is good for all kinds of riding photos. You can use it for silhouettes, you can do side-on riding shots, you can use it for group photos as well, but I do find it can be a little bland. The standard lens on an Apple iPhone is equivalent to a 28mm lens if you were shooting with a 35mm camera. As I said, that length is great for everything, but it's also a little boring for everything. So I actually tend to avoid that lens and I use either the wide or the telephoto more often. The telephoto lens is either the 2x or the 3x lens in your camera. What that does is it zooms in, and as discussed in part 1 of this video series, it causes a compression effect going on with the background. It brings the background closer to your subject, makes the background look larger in comparison to the subject, and this can be used as a great way of minimizing colors and composition and frame out a lot of the visually cluttering elements that might be present in a frame if you were to zoom out. By using the telephoto lens, you can keep your photos nice and simple. You can get some layering effects if you are in the mountains. The number of color elements in a frame can be reduced, and generally you can end up with a more simple image overall. Alright, Alright, so along with the concepts of shooting in nice light, minimizing the color elements out of your frame, and how to use the different lenses in your camera in different scenarios, I want to talk about the use of editing. Now, I'm not talking about jumping in Photoshop and completely altering an image to be what it wasn't to begin with, but I mean making some subtle touch-ups to your photos to make them look more visually appealing, and also how to overcome some of the basic aesthetic settings that are applied to your images when you shoot a normal image with your phone. The biggest one of these to me is actually to do with colors. Now, when you take a stock photo with your phone, especially if you're using an Apple iPhone, there's a certain amount of contrast applied to the photo, and there's also a certain color tone applied to the photo. Now, every single scene you look at, whether you're shooting in nice light or in very harsh light, is going to have a certain color tone to it. If you're shooting in harsh midday light, that color tone will often be very blue and white. If you're shooting in the late afternoon, that color tone will often be very gold, red, and green. One of the things that your phone will often do when looking at a scene is apply a certain look to it in order to give it the most neutral setting and neutral scene it possibly can. The difficulty with this is that the scene that you get in your phone is often not reflective of what your eye is seeing. Just like the average exposure that your phone applies when it looks at a scene, that average color setting is not always accurate and it needs manually overriding it. And this is where editing comes into my photography process. One of the great things about simply using the Photos app in your phone is that every setting you apply is reversible. So what I often do when I'm playing around with editing photos in my phone is I go back and forth tweaking elements of the photo until I get a photo that I'm happy with, and if I don't like it, I just start again. The process that I apply to editing my photos is to bring the exposure up a little bit, to bring the contrast up a little bit. I often reduce the highlights down and bring the shadows up, and I warm up the photo quite a bit as well. I don't play around too much with saturation because it's very easy to overdo it, but if you are shooting in nice light, you'll find that the saturation doesn't need touching anyway. You don't actually have to do massive changes to your photos to make those subtle tweaks that make it more visually appealing. Say for example, if you're shooting in the late afternoon and your photo has some blue elements to it, if you simply warm up the color tone of your photo to add more yellow elements into it, what that does is it reduces the blues out of the image and you'll end up with less colors in your image and a more realistic sunset style of photo. Like photography, one of the things about editing is that it is very subjective. I can't tell you what makes for a good photo. You need to play around and see what appeals to you. Having said that, understanding the fact that your phone is always looking to neutralize every element of your phone to give you an average looking scene is going to give you a starting point from which you can then go and edit your photo to turn it more into the way that you would like it to look. So if your photo doesn't have that warm, rich tone that you're hoping for in the late afternoon, you can drag up the warmth. If you are shooting in some harsh light and the details in the shadows of your photo are lost, you can bring up the shadows so you can see more of that going on. There are obviously infinite ways of adjusting your photos so that your subject comes out more, and it's always important not to underestimate the power of a good edit on a photo in order to make it look that little bit better. Having said that, I don't believe that you can take a terrible photo and make it good by editing. I do think that you can simply take a good photo to start with and make it great by editing. Along with editing to make your photo look more visually appealing, another thing that you can apply when you are editing is cropping in order to get rid of some additional elements that might be in your frame, meaning that the photo is too busy. By using the cropping function, you can get rid of busy elements outside the frame. You'll find that you can straighten your horizons, and in general, you'll find a well-cropped image is often going to be more interesting than one that's left without any cropping at all. Okay, now on to point number 6, and this is how you can use the live photo long exposure to get a creative image without doing anything more than taking a simple photo with your phone and applying a setting straight to it. The live photo long exposure replicates a long exposure by blending all the frames of your live image together to give you what looks like a long exposure but actually isn't a long exposure. Now, a long exposure traditionally with a real camera would be where you leave the shutter open for a couple of seconds and any elements within the frame that are moving get blurred. The iPhone can replicate that in camera by taking a small snippet of video and then blending all of the images together in order to recreate that blurred look. In part 1 of this video series, I talked about the live photo and why I don't use it too much, but in recent months, I've started to use live photo more and more often and create this live photo long exposure look in editing afterwards. The live photo long exposure is actually not very applicable to cycling photography, but it is applicable to lots of other styles of photography, in particular landscape photography. Now, as you can see here, when I was in Queensland, Australia, I was at a place with a waterfall. I turned on the live photo function, I adjusted the exposure, and then I took a photo holding my phone very still. I then went up to the top corner, used that drop-down menu and pressed long exposure, and all of the frames within that live photo were blended into one and the waterfall looks like it's moving. Here are a few more examples of how I use live photo long exposure in an interesting way. One of the most important things with using this function is you need to hold your camera very, very still. If the camera's moving around, no subject within the frame is going to be kept still, and you'll end up with an image that's too blurry in general. Another example is this photo here that I shot out the side of a moving bus the other day. As you can see, the photo to begin with was quite boring, but once I applied that long exposure to it, it actually turned into a really unique looking photo. As I said, because of the fact that all the frames in that live photo are getting blended together, if there's any movement going on, you'll find that your image is too blurry. And for this reason, this doesn't actually work that well for cycling photography from the bike. The reason why is there's no way to hold perfectly still while you're riding your bike. Even if you're on an extremely smooth road, you'll find that there's some movement going on, and no matter how still you think you're holding your phone, the edges of your subject are going to end up a little bit blurred. I've said it a couple of times, but I will say it again. When using this function, you do need to keep the subject in your frame very, very still in order for this to work properly. But if you don't, it can still make for some pretty creative and interesting looking images. It's great if you are in a setting where you can hold really, really still and have one element moving within the frame. And on the bike, provided you use it in an interesting way, you can get some great shots. Have a play around with it and let me know what you guys think. Just bear in mind that it's very easy to overdo this look and you'll end up with too many images that just look like a blurry mess. It's a fun trick to whip out every so often though, in the right scenario, and I'd love to see what you guys come up with if you're willing to share your photos with me via Instagram or something that I'm going to mention at the end of this video. Alrighty, so point number 7, my second last of the video. I'm gonna keep this one nice and simple and let you guys figure out what I mean. The garbage can is the best piece of equipment you have. It is true that if you're looking for feedback, you need to put your bad photos out there as well as your good, so you can figure out what you're doing wrong and get critique and criticism on those bad photos in order to improve. But over the course of my photography journey, I've taken literally millions of images with my cameras, and I've only got about 40 or 50 on my website on display. The best artists are often very good at working out what's terrible about an image and getting rid of it, rather than showing a half-baked image that isn't quite up to the standard of what they can produce and finding that they as an artist have their personal brand let down by it. By limiting the viewership of your worst work, you'll find that any criticism that does come back from your best photos that are out there helps you become a better photographer, because you're not making changes to images that were never very good to begin with. The reason that I say the most important tool that you can use is the garbage can is because this is a rule that I've used throughout my entire photographic journey, and I found it's helped lift the quality of my work to where it is now. Alrighty, now that brings me up to point 8 of this video, my final point of the video, and this is this. Practice is key. Just like anything in life, the more you do something, the better you're going to get. One of the great things with taking photos with your phone is the fact that you can take as many as you like and you can just delete them as you go, and you don't need to worry about the financial outlay of doing that. I always recommend people shoot lots in lots of different settings and work out what they like in an image and also what they don't like in order to find their visual style, and also in order to understand the basics of photography in a more complex way. And so when it comes time to creating a great image, you know how to do so. The reason I say shoot lots and delete lots is because you want to have more options to choose from and more photos to learn from, and then you can get rid of the ones that you don't need after the fact. Some people are going to tell me that the best photographers can walk into a scene, take one photo, and it's going to be brilliant. That is very true, but while you're learning, it's important to shoot in lots of different settings and work out what makes for a great photo, rather than just taking a single image and being like, there, I'm done. Cycling's such a fast-moving sport that it's very difficult to get that one perfect moment. So if you've got more options to choose from to begin with, you'll end up with more options to choose from later on, and more potential to have a winning photo and a keeper that you're proud of. As I said at the start of this point, the more you do something, the better you become, and photography is no different. Shoot lots, delete lots, analyze your work, and you'll find that you become a much better photographer over time. Alrighty, now that brings us up to the end of this part 2 of this video series, with part 3 coming very soon. If you have made it to this part of the video, can you please let me know? I'd love to know how many of you got to the end. Just whack a 0.5 times FTW down in the description. The next thing I do want to say is that I'm actually interested in seeing the photos that you guys are producing with your phone. I'm gonna make a YouTube episode about critiquing photos that I've received from you guys in the future. If you are interested in being a part of this, please send me 3 of your favorite cycling photos that you've taken with your phone to the email address that I'm putting on the screen right now. I'm going to choose 10 images from the ones that are submitted, so please do send me up to 3 of your favorite photos and I'll let you know if your ones have been chosen. Channel memberships are also now open if you are interested in supporting me further while I make these videos. I'm looking forward to seeing you guys for part 3 coming very soon, and I hope you enjoyed. I'll chat to you soon. Adeu.